Welcome to Customs and GST Advisory. In today's video, we are going to discuss a very important and often misunderstood concept under the CGST Act 2017. The question is simple but legally very significant. Can every supply be outward supply? At first glance, the answer may appear obvious. Many people use the word supply, outward supply, and inward supply almost interchangeably. But under GST law, these expressions are not identical. Supply is the main concept defined under Section 7 of the CGST Act. Outward supply is defined from the viewpoint of the supplier. Inward supply is defined from the viewpoint of the recipient. So, the real question is not merely whether a transaction is a supply. The real question is whose supply is it, who is making it, who is receiving it, and for whom does it become outward or inward supply. Let us understand this step by step. Let us begin with the basic question. What is supply under GST? The answer starts from Section 7 of the CGST Act 2017. Section 7 is the central provision that explains the scope of supply under GST. It tells us what kinds of activities or transactions can be treated as supply for the purposes of the Act. It includes familiar commercial transactions such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, and disposal. But Section 7 does not stop at ordinary sale transactions. It also covers certain special situations, such as import of services for consideration, even where the activity may not be in the course or furtherance of business, and certain Schedule 1 activities even without consideration. Therefore, Section 7 is the starting point. Before asking whether something is outward supply or inward supply, we must first ask, does this transaction amount to supply under Section 7? Only after that can we examine whose outward supply it is and whose inward supply it is. Now, Section 7 gives us the comprehensive legal meaning of supply under CGST, IGST, SGST, or UTGST. When goods or services move from one person to another, the law first examines whether that activity falls within the scope of supply. For example, where goods are sold for a price in the course of business, it is supply. Where services are provided for consideration in business, it is supply. Where goods are leased, licensed, rented, transferred, or exchanged, those activities may also fall within the scope of supply depending on the facts. So, the word supply is the foundation. But outward supply and inward supply are not separate taxable events independent of Section 7. They are relational concepts. From the side of the person who makes the supply, it may be outward supply. From the side of the person who receives the same goods or services, it may be inward supply. So, one transaction may have two viewpoints. For the supplier, it is outward. For the recipient, it is inward. That is why we must not say mechanically that every supply is outward supply. We must ask, outward supply of whom? This frame explains the relationship clearly. At the top, we have the main concept supply. From this concept, two important directions emerge: outward supply and inward supply. Outward supply is defined in Section 283 of the CGST Act. It refers to a supply of goods or services or both, made or agreed to be made by a taxable person in the course or furtherance of business. So, outward supply looks at the transaction from the supplier's side. If I am the person making the supply and I am doing it in the course or furtherance of business, then it may be my outward supply. On the other hand, inward supply is defined in Section 267. It refers to receipt of goods or services or both, whether by purchase, acquisition, or any other means, with or without consideration. So, inward supply looks at the transaction from the recipient's side. If I am receiving the goods or services, then from my side it may be inward supply. Therefore, the same transaction may be outward supply for one person and inward supply for another. This is the key to understanding the issue. The words are related, but they operate from different legal viewpoints. Now, the important question arises: if every taxable discussion begins with the word supply, then why does the Act separately define outward supply and inward supply? The answer lies in compliance, reporting, and person specific tax consequences. For example, when a supplier issues an invoice, reports supplies, files returns, or calculates outward liability, the law often looks at outward supply. But when the recipient receives goods or services, claims input tax credit, accounts for purchases, or deals with reverse charge liability, the law looks at inward supply. This is why the distinction matters. If the transaction is viewed from the wrong side, the entire legal analysis may become confused. For instance, a service received by a person cannot be called his outward supply merely because it is a supply under Section 7. It may be a supply under GST law, but for the recipient, it is not outward supply, it is inward supply. Similarly, in reverse charge cases, the recipient may be liable to pay tax, but that does not automatically convert the received service into his outward supply. That is why the question marks in this frame are very important. They remind us that taxability, reporting, and compliance must be examined separately. So, are supply and outward supply really the same? The answer is no, they are not exactly the same. Supply is the broad statutory concept under Section 7. Outward supply is a specific expression used in relation to the person who makes the supply. Inward supply is a specific expression used in relation to the person who receives the supply. Therefore, the correct legal proposition is every outward supply must first be a supply, but every supply need not be outward supply of every person. A transaction may be supply under Section 7, but whether it is outward supply or inward supply depends on the position of the person being examined. If the person is the supplier, it may be outward supply. If the person is the recipient, it may be inward supply. This distinction is very important in GST law because it affects return reporting, input tax credit, reverse charge turnover analysis, and departmental proceedings. So, the title question, can every supply be outward supplied, should be answered carefully. The better answer is every supply cannot automatically be treated as outward supply. It becomes outward supply only in relation to the person who makes that supply. Now, let us test our understanding with a practical GST question. We have understood that Section 7 defines supply, while outward supply and inward supply depend on the position of the supplier and the recipient. So here is the question. If a company gives a corporate guarantee, under which part of Section 7 of the CGST Act 2017 is it covered? If consideration is charged, does it fall under Section 7(1)(a? And if it is given without consideration to a related person, does it fall under Section 7(1)(c)? Read with Schedule 1. Tell us your answer in the comments before we reveal the correct legal position. The answer is it depends on consideration. If corporate guarantee is given for consideration, it falls under Section 7(1)(a) as a supply of service for consideration in the course or furtherance of business. If it is given without consideration between related persons, it may fall under Section 7(1)(c). Read with Schedule 1 paragraph 2 because Schedule 1 treats certain supplies between related persons as supply even without consideration. Rule 28. 2. Then helps in valuation of such corporate guarantee service. It does not replace Section 7. So the correct answer is with consideration, Section 7(1)(a). Without consideration between related persons, Section 7(1)(c). Read with Schedule 1. Now here is a deeper question for you based on judicial interpretation of the very concept of supply. We have understood that Section 7 defines supply, while outward supply and inward supply are person-based concepts, one from the supplier's side and the other from the recipient's side. But now ask this, can there be a supply if the supplier and recipient are not really two different persons? In the famous Calcutta Club judgment, the Supreme Court applied the doctrine of mutuality and accepted that a club and its members could not be treated as two separate persons for the earlier tax regime. But under GST, Section 7 was later amended to insert Section 7(1)(aa), which deems transactions between a person other than an individual and its members or constituents as supply. So the puzzle is this: does GST law now validly create supply by legal fiction, or does the basic concept of supply still require two real distinct persons, one supplier and one recipient? Think carefully and write your answer in the comments. Thank you for watching this GST explainer by Customs and GST Advisory. In today's video, we discussed an important legal concept under the CGST Act 2017, whether every supply can be treated as the outward supply. We saw that supply is the main concept under Section 7, while outward supply and inward supply are understood from the perspective of the supplier and the recipient respectively. The key takeaway is simple. Supply is the wider statutory concept. Outward supply is supply from the supplier's side. Inward supply is supply from the recipient's side. So every outward supply must first be a supply, but every supply is not outward supply in relation to every person. We hope this discussion helped simplify this important GST issue for you. For more expert insights on customs, GST, DGFT, Exime, and indirect tax law, do visit our website customsgst.com. If you found this video useful, please subscribe, like, and comment with your valuable suggestions and questions. Thank you once again for joining us. This is Customs and GST Advisory, Expert Guidance, Complete Compliance, Global Confidence.